Vikings were raiders. From the 8th to 11th century, they made the lives of medieval Europe even worse by plundering the undefended villages, stealing, and killing everyone who got in their way. Vikings were certainly brutal, don't get me wrong, but we see today that the Vikings were far more than just the barbarians they were made out to be. If there was one thing a Viking was first and foremost, he was a sailor. Their fantastically crafted ships allowed the Scandinavians to explore new lands, either peacefully or not. The Viking Age, yes, was an age of pillaging and bloodshed, but it was also an age of colonization and exploration. Even sailed to a mysterious land known as Finland, a land told in the oral tradition of Icelandic stories, one with enough bountiful berries to make wine and populated by screeching people which fought back the newcomers. What was Finland? Well, today we know it by simply Newfoundland, Canada. Yep, by the time Columbus discovered America, the New World had been talked about in Viking legend for generations. The colony of Finland failed in the span of a few years. There was just too much going against it to be successful. But the idea of Scandinavians somehow living in the New World 500 years before Columbus is far too interesting to just not talk about. So let's imagine, what if in an alternate timeline, the Vikings stayed in America? That failed colony of Finland somehow stays alive, just like Iceland. Before I get into that question, I want to answer this one. Why did Finland fail in the first place? First are the natives themselves, or Skringling, as the Vikings called them. The Vikings and natives did not get along. The very first confrontation involved the Vikings killing two natives, while the natives then chased them off. Second was the population of Scandinavia itself. The Vikings were far outnumbered. The Scandinavian population was minuscule. A huge Viking population in Canada? Not likely. Third was navigation and technology. Even for the Vikings, the journey was tough. So don't imagine the regular trips that future societies easily could do to the New World. Vikings were best on the shore and not really in the open ocean. The point I'm making is, I know Finland surviving is practically impossible. This is more or less for fun, taking all those factors into account. So, on to the scenario. If you're imagining North America in this alternate timeline having some hybrid culture between Vikings and natives, well, I'm sorry to crush your dreams. Vikings never wanted to intermingle with the natives, and even if somehow they did, there were too few Vikings to create some hybrid culture. The colony would simply become less Scandinavian over time and disappear. What I qualify as colonization and success is Finland simply surviving to create a lasting Scandinavian presence in Canada. Be enough of a success that word comes out, more Vikings actually show up to sustain the colony in North America. The first thing that needs to change is the relationship between Viking and native. In this alternate timeline, peace somehow is maintained between the two for a while. How long? Long enough. Low population meant any conflict would kill Finland. But if peace lasted just enough for Vikings to be enticed to sail to the land of wine, then the cycle could be reinforced. A good defense means more colonists, which means a better defense. If war breaks out later, fine. But it can only break out once the Vikings have enough of a foothold in America. So Finland by now has a reputation, a far-off land with strange natives, but full of grapes to make wine from. Naming of lands for Vikings meant everything. Why do you think this notably not green place is named Greenland? They needed people to go there so the colony wouldn't die, and die that colony would. In our timeline, Greenland became a pitiful struggling colony, and bad winters forced the Vikings off and back to Iceland. However, in this alternate timeline, if Finland still survived, then those Greenland refugees could easily flee to Canada instead, bolstering the colony's population. As the centuries went on and the Viking Age would end, the settlement would grow, becoming a stopping point for eventually the Danish, or Norwegians, or Swedish to trade supplies with and maybe explore further south. Because of that reliance on the constant trade with Europe, Europe would slowly begin to realize just where Finland actually was. As the Viking Age ended and European empires begin, Vinland would change hands between Norway and Denmark numerous times. Rumors would always be abound, primarily in Scandinavian circles, about land south of Vinland, with vast forests and warm weather. It wouldn't be until the Renaissance when those rumors were actually mapped. Would it be Columbus who would sail across the ocean blue in 1492? No. The only reason nobody sailed the ocean before Columbus was because everybody thought they would just die. Columbus was an idiot who thought the Earth was shaped like a pear, so they just let him go. But in an alternate world where the Scandinavians have been using this path across the Atlantic for centuries, everyone would know something, be it Asia or another land, was across that ocean. There is much less risk when people have been sailing that route since the 10th century, so explorers might map out the coast centuries before our own timeline. Vinland would be an established European colony to get supplies from and sail further south. It wouldn't be the Spanish or the Portuguese to have the first major empire in the Americas. It would be the Swedish. Sweden in our timeline tried their own little colonial effort in Delaware. It didn't go anywhere. However, if the Scandinavians had Vinland, then they would have the first opportunity to colonize the new land. Well, when I said there wouldn't be a Viking empire, I never said their descendants wouldn't. Vinland replaces Quebec in this alternate timeline. The Norwegian and Swedish have first pick on the land and claim it before the English and French ever reach it. Could they hold it? Well, who knows. Instead of Spain and Portugal kickstarting the Age of Exploration, it would be the Scandinavians, perhaps launching them into having an empire just like the British, French, and Spanish of our own timeline. What happens after that? Well, I feel there are multiple possibilities. In general, the Americas would be something Europe would have known about for centuries before actually reaching it. It'd always be a rumor, and the first people to really take advantage of it would be the Viking descendants themselves. This, however, is simply one scenario out of the countless that could happen. We'll never truly know what would happen if Vikings colonized America, but it's fun to theorize. This is Cody of Alternate History Hub.